Hello, I'm Dr. Jodie Richardson, and you're listening to Well, Hello Anxiety, a podcast where we end the struggle with anxiety and build our toolkit of practical skills to thrive. I should have a solid hour and a half to get work done if I get going right away. I shuffle an untidy stack of research articles on sex trading among incarcerated women, pull out several relevant ones, and begin the work of revising the discussion section of my article. I've just gotten into a satisfying flow when a sweet song drifts over from the room next door. Mommy, I'm awake. Without missing a beat, I finish my sentence and head to my angel's room. I'm totally kidding. It's more like this. With frustration bordering on rage, I curse everyone from my husband for going to his office seemingly guilt and worry-free, the grandparents for not being there to help out, my colleagues for wanting this paper to go out, and my 4-year-old for being awake. Amid the frustrated rage, a seed of guilt quickly blossoms into a towering oak tree. I feel pissed off, guilty, and deeply conflicted over what to do. As my kiddo's sweet sing-song transitions to a tyrannical, "Mommy, come now," I take a deep breath, snap my computer shut, and head to his room. These are the opening paragraphs from my guest today's book. I do not know of a working parent who can't relate. Yael Schonbrun, PhD, is a clinical psychologist, assistant professor at Brown University, co-host of the wonderful podcast Psychologists Off the Clock, and mum of 3. Her writing on work, parenting, and relationships has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Greater Good Science Center, Behavioral Scientist, Tricycle, among others. And she is the author of Work, Parent, Thrive, 12 science-backed strategies to ditch guilt, manage overwhelm, and grow connection when everything feels like too much. Yael, where have you been all my life?
Well, where have you been all of my life? I've had the chance to catch up on your podcast, and it's wonderful. What an amazing resource. And as we were saying before we started recording, I think our podcasts and our thinking really aligns in terms of how we approach the really uncomfortable experiences of living, including working parenthood.
Yes, absolutely, we do. And I just want to thank you so much for your honesty, the vulnerability that it took to write that opening and to share, as you do throughout the book, about your own experiences and the experience of others. And thank you for writing it. I think it's a classic case of expectation versus reality, isn't it, when we become parents? Can you tell us more about what that was like for you when you first became a parent to your gorgeous first boy?
Yeah, he's still gorgeous, and he's 13 years old and still my baby.
Wow.
Yep. Yeah, it kind of blows my mind that he's entered the teen years. But yeah, I was a trained clinical psychologist on my postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University when I had him. And I specialized in relationships and was doing academic research and some practice and loved my job, had a very progressive, supportive professional environment, had a wonderful, supportive, egalitarian marriage, and thought, I got this in the bag. So when I had the baby and then I had to go back to work, which I really wanted to do, I was really shocked at how hard it was and really surprised at how sad I was, no matter what I was doing. So I would cry on my long commute to work with him in the back of my car, drop him off at daycare, then feel just despair all day while I sat at my desk and worked on grants and data analysis, and then pick him up and feel exhausted on my way home. And then all night I would feel guilty that I wasn't doing work and that all my colleagues were lapping me. And I just started thinking, what is wrong with this? And so I did what all nerdy people do. And I started reading everything I could get my hands on from the bookstore and the library. And a lot of what I read there was helpful and important, but a lot of it felt very bleak and despairing and kind of hopeless. A lot about time management, which I was doing just fine at, and a lot about the inequitable social policy that we have. And equal marriage is that one wasn't such a problem, but it did feel like something was wrong, even though there wasn't anything wrong. And so I started thinking, there has to be something more. And so from there, I started digging into the academic literature. And what I found there was actually more in keeping with what I was looking for. Because as a relationship researcher, I'm really interested in how things relate to each other. Traditionally, we think about how people relate to each other, but I found this really fascinating body of work that was looking at how roles relate to each other. So we often think about our various demanding roles as being largely in conflict with one another. They're in conflict and competing for our time and our energy and our resources in all sorts of ways. But actually, the relationship between our roles, just like relationship between people, is much more complicated than that. And really what the research bears out is that they do conflict and they also enrich each other. And so from there, I started really thinking about the positive ways that this role tension exists for people who inhabit multiple competing, demanding roles. And I started thinking about how that can help our creativity, how that can help our ability to take breaks, because we have sort of forced breaks from one role when we step into the other. I started thinking about ways that it can enrich our primary romantic relationships, ways that it can help us parent better and work better in all sorts of really cool science-backed ways. And from that, I started thinking that I should write a book about it, because that's kind of the book that I wanted. I wanted something more optimistic that would help me to see that, yes, it is real, you are struggling, but also there are positives to see within the struggle and ways to manage what's hard and access more of what is enjoyable and satisfying more easily. And so that's sort of the birth story of this book.
I really appreciate that the book is coming from a positive perspective, because there are so many experiences that I think make a positive difference in the experience of being a parent and a working parent. I remember my brother said to me, because of my anxiety, he said, "Oh, you're just not going to have time to worry about things when you become a parent." And I found that that was a positive, because you just got to keep moving forward. And when it came to work, I found that I had this idea of two hats. I remember a friend saying to me, "You've kind of got two hats. You've got to take one off and put the other one on." That was powerful for me in the early days, because I think one of the hardest things that I found was this idea that you have to leave things unfinished. And that is tricky when you're the sort of person that likes to tie off loose ends. But a huge part of it, even though there were these positive aspects, huge part of it was the guilt around exactly what you said before, and the despair, and also the anxiety about, how's tomorrow going to go when I drop them off? What if we can't part ways? What if I can't make my meeting on time? What if I don't get any sleep? Those what if questions. And so how did you start to untangle all of those challenges and start to look at them through a different sort of more enrichment lens versus a conflict lens?
What's so important about what you're saying is that it is true that there are challenges, and it is true that within the challenges, there are opportunities, and really amazing opportunities. And that is consistently what the science bears out. Like, anxiety is really uncomfortable and sometimes problematic. And also it's very helpful and important and informative and motivating and connecting. I am somebody who's really enamored with positive psychology. So this sort of merging of my interest in relationships and in happiness science really brought me to thinking about how this package deal of roles that people inhabit can sort of occupy the same space that happiness science does, which really talks about, even in uncomfortable experiences, there's often opportunities that are embedded in it. And, that doesn't undo the fact, and I think this is really important, sort of like separating out the ability to find good in what's hard from toxic positivity, because this is very different. And your podcast does a wonderful job of disentangling those, because what you're not saying is, don't worry about anxiety. It's not a big deal. Just think positive and it won't bother you. You're actually saying, make space for it. It is uncomfortable. Have self-compassion along the way. And as you do, you may find that some of what anxiety offers is quite positive and has gifts embedded within it. So we can learn to manage the parts that are hard, that are not very productive, but also harness what is quite productive about it. This was something that I spent years disentangling, but it really started with this idea that I found in the academic science of work-family enrichment, which is very simply this concept. So just like work-family conflict is this idea that our two roles compete and make each one harder because of the competition. Work-family enrichment is simply the idea that our roles help each other out. And there's three distinct paths that researchers have identified through analysis of the interviews, the dozens and dozens of interviews that I did. And I conducted this qualitative analysis of the transcripts that I found these three pathways really bear out. So the first is what I call the transfer effect. So it's the idea that when you step from one role into another, you're stepping out of one role. Whatever role you're now in, you're building skills. Whatever role you're not in, you're taking a break from. And those skills that you're building in one role often helpfully feed back into the other. So you and I both podcast, we work with people who have anxiety. And lo and behold, many of the skills that we engage in at work are quite helpful for our kids because we help them, guide them in managing their emotional health. We, in theory, probably teach them about technology, or although more likely they're teaching us how to use our podcast equipment.
Yes.
And vice versa, right? When we're in parenting mode, we're doing perspective taking, we're often very curious, we're often trying to be very patient, and those kinds of skills are very helpful in most workplaces. So often you see this opportunity for each role to enhance the other because of what it offers while you're in the role and while you're away from the role that you've stepped out of. And we can talk about this later, but there's also really interesting opportunities to get rest because of the pressure between roles. It's counterintuitive, and opportunities to get creative. So just as you said, one thing that had been hard for you in the past in your early parenting life was stopping a task before you were done at work in order to go parent. But what research shows is that when we step away, when we stop attending consciously to a task, the more creative parts of our brain get to work. This is the default mode network. And that's where some of our more creative thinking happens. So actually, by being forced to step away from something when you otherwise wouldn't, you have these creative benefits. So that was pretty cool. So the second path is the stress buffer effect. And that's the idea that if you're having a tough time in one role and you get pressed to step into another, you get a break from what's stressful. So the most poignant example that I describe in my book is a colleague of mine who had a child who was fighting cancer. And it's not like the cancer ever left his mind, but he had an opportunity to focus on something else when he went to work. It gave him a break. And there are much more everyday examples of that too. I remember when my children were really tiny and not sleeping that well, and I got really obsessed with their sleep because I was so tired, that strangely going to work felt like a break, even though I wasn't sleeping. It was just a time not to worry about that. And that can be helpful for anxiety in all sorts of areas, that if we're stressed out about work and we go home and we get a hug from our kid, it sort of helps us to take a break from that anxiety or stress. The last pathway that is distinct is what's called the additive effect. And that's the idea, and you talk a lot about this on your podcast, that we sometimes think about happiness as pleasure and gratification, but psychologists have another definition, which is a sense of meaning and purpose. And when we occupy multiple roles, we have a broader opportunity to develop meaning and purpose. And we sort of can spread our existential eggs in lots of different baskets, but also different phases of life offer different kinds of meaning. For example, a lot of parents, when their children go off to college and start their own lives, there's a sense of emptiness, but we can re-enter or commit ourselves more diligently to our work and find meaning there. Same thing goes if you're having a tough time at work, you can really focus on cultivating meaning in our home lives. So those three pathways are these distinct ways to harness more of that enrichment. And the enrichment isn't separate from the conflict. It's almost because of it. And that's what's cool too.
That is so cool. And as you were sharing each of those different ideas, I could reflect on an example that related to my own work. I imagine that our listeners today will be doing the same, and particularly the creativity that, like you say, with the podcast, for example, sometimes I am unsure of how to start and where I want to begin a conversation so that we can share when I have a guest, and you would find the same thing. What are we going to talk about? Which direction are we going to take this, and how do I want to begin? Sometimes I can sit at my computer and I'll be researching a guest and doing all of the background research and reading the book and preparing. But it's typically when I'm making dinner or in the
Totally.
shower, or driving back from dropping one of the kids off at a sport, that the idea will come to me. And that's just one of so many examples.
Yeah. I'm sure everybody can think of an example, but I always think about the fight that you have with your partner where you just didn't have the good comeback in the moment, and 2 hours later when you're taking a shower, you're like, oh, if I'd only said this thing. But
Yes.
I do relate to it in a more productive way too.
Yes.
I just started a newsletter about relationships. And so I always try to include some kind of fun story. And what I've found myself doing a lot is using children's stories that I've read recently with my boys. And so it's such a fun way to make the content, which, I write a lot about academic content. And so my kids give me ways to make it a lot more accessible for people who are not that interested in reading scientific studies, which is most people.
Yes, yes. It's like the science comes alive in your house every single day.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I must admit I chuckled about earlier was when you talked about the transfer effect and how we share what we learn in our work with our families. And sometimes that's not always appreciated.
Oh my gosh. No, it is not. My kids now tease me. They love saying research shows, but like in a real snarky way. When my 13-year-old told me recently, research shows psychologist moms can be boring. No, I don't know what you're talking about.
I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know. That's so good. I love it. I love it that they can have some fun with it. But what they have the benefit of, and that's the thing, as educators, as podcasters, as people, we both care so deeply about sharing what we learn with others. So what I share on my podcast is what I'm doing in my family, what I'm doing myself, and the same with you. And what you're sharing with us today, one of the things that has come to mind is this idea that we find ourselves in this world where we are working parents, both parts of our lives, and we have lots of different aspects to our lives, lots of different domains. They're all important to us. One of the things that I know makes a difference and helps us to think about it from the point of view of enrichment, and the three examples that you shared before, I'd like to continue to explore also this idea of acceptance, that this is the way we are living our lives, and the way we can approach it can help us to really take advantage of those three different ways that it can enrich all of the different domains of our lives.
Yeah, and I think that part of why acceptance in this realm has been generally so hard to come by is that the way that work-family conflict is often talked about is in this very outside and we can fix it kind of way, as if like, work-family conflict is like a machine that has a broken part. And if we just fix social policy and marriages and supportive work environments, then we won't feel it. And so what I try to do in my work is really to unpack, to disentangle those pieces, that there are parts of working parenthood that can be made far easier and need to be made far easier through progress that we make in society and in our workplaces and in our marriages, that there are really some inhumane things that are happening that make working parenthood virtually intolerable and unsustainable. That said, there's also this part that's just very human. If you inhabit multiple roles, which most adults do, right? You're a friend, you're a child, you're a worker, you're a parent, you're a pet owner, you're a hobbyist, you're a member of a spiritual community. Whatever your roles are, the richer your life is, the more roles you inhabit. But by dint of that fact, you're also pulled in lots of different directions, meaning that if you have a full, rich life, you're going to experience conflict between roles. And that's not a flaw. It's not a bug in the system. It's actually a feature of it. And it has some discomfort. That is true. But it also has some really wonderful parts, which is why it's adaptive, right? Because we want to be participating in lots of different areas of life. And in fact, some of the earliest scientific research in the 1800s, there was a French sociologist by the name of Emile Durkheim who went across Europe collecting data looking at risk factors for suicide. And what he found was that folks who inhabited lots of different roles, who had more role obligations, were at lower risk for suicide than those that had fewer. So we like to think about this idea of, oh, if I just didn't have obligations, if I wasn't pulled in so many directions, I'd feel happier. Well, actually, that's not quite true. We do better when we're pulled in more directions. To an extent, there's obviously a level to which it can go too far.
Yeah.
But it's not problem in and of itself to be pulled in lots of different directions. It's a good thing. It's really about how we approach it. So if we can accept that human part of it, we can learn to manage the parts that are uncomfortable more skillfully. And what I argue is that it also leaves us with better energy. If we don't fight the battles that are unwinnable, we have more resources to fight the battles where we can make progress. In other words, like social policy is something that can be changed, but the fact of being pulled in lots of different directions in a full and rich life can't.
Yes, that's right. And those things, they're big battles. They take time. And what we can control is in the here and now.
Exactly.
Yes. One of the things that you wrote about is the relationship between how we feel about our work status. Are we working or are we not working? Are we a working parent or are we a non-working parent? Well, non-working outside the home parent, just to be clear, a stay-at-home parent. And the way we feel about our working status has a bearing on the outcomes for ourselves and our children.
Yeah, there's some really fascinating research in this domain where researchers collect data, usually with mothers, unfortunately. It would be great if fathers were included in these data sets, but largely it's focused on mothers. But status of mothers' employment matters less for their own psychological well-being and less for their children's outcomes, developmental, social, academic, than how they feel about that status. So mothers who feel happy about their work status, whether they're working full-time, part-time, or they are, full-time parents, have better psychological well-being, and kids who do better than parents who feel poorly about their status. I didn't have a chance to cite it in my book because it came out after the book came out, but there's this really fascinating study with low-wage earners where the researchers did this analysis where they separated folks out by culture, by ethnic background. This is a statistical finding, so I always like to make that clear. Latina mothers were more likely to see working as being problematic for their families and their children, whereas African American mothers were more likely to regard it as something to be proud of, a way to contribute to their family. Even among these low-wage workers where work was hard, right? It was hourly wages. They didn't necessarily have a lot of support, but the difference in how they regarded their role as workers shifted, whether they were more likely to be depressed, which had an impact on how they interacted with their children, which had an impact on how children developed over the first year of life. So it's really remarkable how our mindset about whether we work or not matters. And I will say for myself, like when I first became a working parent, I felt tremendously guilty and anxious. Like, am I doing my child wrong? So for me, this research is really important to get into the hands of folks who are in this position because it helps you shift your mindset. You're not doing anything wrong to your child by working. In fact, there are benefits that they have, right? There's pros and cons to everything, but there's opportunities for your children to connect with other caregivers, to develop some more independence, and for you to get a break. And in fact, humans are wired to rear children in groups, right? This is what we know from evolutionary science. And so in a way, working parenthood kind of pressures you to create more of a collective child rearing experience for your kid, which is good for you and good for your kid, because that is how humans are engineered to raise children, because it's such a demanding, taxing role.
Yes. And the village that we can create for ourselves, it makes such a difference for each and every one of us as part of it. I got a text message the other day. I was part of a group. One of my friends' children was unwell and needed picking up from the high school, and both parents were miles away. I was home, working from home, and I said, yes, I would be delighted to go and do that. It made me feel really good that I could be the one that could make the difference for them. Whereas I'm sure that on the other end of that text message, they were thinking, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Who are we going to ask? We need help. And yet, on the receiving end of that, it felt like a privilege to be trusted, to be asked, and to be able to go and pick this teenager up, drop them home, and they could be where they needed to be. So I think we can sometimes feel like asking our village for help is putting a burden on others. But in fact, equally as we will help, we will be the ones asking at times. It works so beautifully when we can see it from both sides of the coin.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's often hard to be the one asking for help, but knowing that actually it feels quite good to be asked for help and remembering that when you've been asked for help, you've often felt really helpful. And, I think, again, the science on this is so interesting because giving to others, contributing, makes us feel happier for longer than receiving contributions from others. So it's almost like a gift that you're offering somebody by asking for assistance. Obviously, it can go too far, but in
Yes.
general, it's like a really nice thing. And I do think, recognizing the power for you and for your kids of creating, little families. Like I live very far away from my parents and from my partner's parents. So when we first started having children, it felt scary. Like we didn't have a support network. And it did take us some time, but we built a little village around us. And part of our village has always been the people that we paid to care for our children while we were working, who ended up, not in the beginning, it took time, but who ended up being like family. My kids are out of daycare now, but I still keep in touch with the providers who cared for them. They're really important to me and to my kids. And I see them as sort of like, I don't know, I don't want to say replacement family, but they've been like a really important part of my life. And they've helped to educate me on being a good parent.
Honestly, the people that we come across in the community and the village as our children go through different ages and stages make such an incredible contribution to our families. And if you have got little ones at daycare, I invite you to just next time you go to pick them up, just watch before they see you. Just watch and see the joy they're having and the interactions and the relationships they're building. It's hard though, isn't it, in those early days, dropping them off, saying goodbye. Oh my goodness, the overwhelming, the tears, the emotion, the guilt, the stress. For parents who are experiencing those types of emotions, whether they're in that situation, dropping little ones off and having a difficult time partying, or the little ones are having a difficult time partying, which is par for the course, or parents who are in other living in other situations whereby there is a lot of stress and they're feeling that guilt, they're experiencing a lot of guilt and a lot of stress. I know that this conversation will start to sort of turn the tide on the mindset when it comes to working and partying and reconnecting. But what else could you share for those parents who are having a really hard time and feel like, oh, I don't know if I can continue to work or if I can continue to kind of spin these plates, so to speak?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, one is that I think anytime you can see those challenges as challenges rather than as threat, like we tend to drop into this threat mindset of like, if I can't figure out how to spin this plate, or if my child is, experiencing this level of distress, then something catastrophic is going to happen either to me or to my kids. And that's part of our wiring. Like that stress response is our brain sort of detecting like the demands on me are more than my resources can handle, right? That's the definition of the stress response, is that difference between the demands and your capacity to meet the demands. And what research has shown is that there's sort of two different ways to interpret that difference in demands versus capacity to respond to the demands. So one is a threat response, which is really easy when you have very young kids because everything feels so fragile. And that makes all the sense in the world. And I can definitely say I had that experience where everything felt like a threat. My kids felt so vulnerable to me, and I worried that I was doing them wrong. And, how could I be this kind of a parent? But more likely in our modern society, most of the time, the stressors that we encounter are more in the realm of challenges. And challenges are good because they help us to grow and they help our kids to grow. When your kid is having a hard time separating from you, that's actually a really great opportunity for them to be building skills of independence. And as we know for ourselves, growth is not comfortable. And so it's okay for them to be uncomfortable, and it's okay for you to be uncomfortable. And it's much easier to tolerate that discomfort when you recognize that this is not a threat in the sense that anything imminent, dangerous, catastrophic is going to happen. It's just uncomfortable, but allowing for it with a sense of hopefulness and optimism that you can grow this skill and that your child can grow this skill makes it much easier. The other pathway that I'd like to chat a little bit about is guilt, which is really an interesting emotion. So functional emotion researchers have defined guilt as a very interpersonal emotion, and its function is to protect our relationships from harm that's been done or from anticipated harm. And so that guilt sort of prompts you to say, ooh, have I done wrong at work? Like, have I dropped the ball and now my colleagues are going to be angry with me? Or with your kids, have I done wrong and sort of left them hanging in a way that is really harmful to them? And often guilt is very social. Like, we worry that other people are going to judge us for having been a bad parent or a bad worker. And so there's no way to stop that, nor should we want it to stop, because it's a really important cue. Like, sometimes you have dropped the ball and you need to apologize. Sometimes you have said something hurtful to your child and you need to own it and learn together how to repair. So guilt is actually quite useful. The problem is that because it's one of these emotions that's hardwired into us, it worked better in pre-modern times, right? Because it really was dangerous for you to harm a relationship and be ousted from the village that you lived in. And it really was dangerous for you not to really be attentive to your kid when they were in distress, because it meant that they would be really vulnerable to the elements or to a predator. These days, guilt gets triggered because our kids are distressed, and often gets triggered because of social messaging that we have that is completely false. Like, your kid is okay if you're not around. Your kid is okay if they're not happy. Your kid is okay if they forgot their jacket, even if it's a cold day. Like, most of the time, your kid is okay and you are okay, even if people are judging you. But that guilt is so uncomfortable, and we're so inclined to respond to it in this way that's self-protective, that sometimes we find ourselves engaging in behavior that's actually counterproductive. So in the realm of parenting, for example, like, if our kid is distressed and we sort of swoop in and we fix whatever it is that's upsetting them, like, you gave them the orange mac and cheese and they wanted the white. Oh my gosh, they're really unhappy. Get them the orange. Now you've taught them that it's dangerous and shouldn't be expected for them to have to tolerate distress, which is actually the recipe for causing them to be more fragile. So if we swoop in, when they forget their homework, or when they feel embarrassed, or when they've flat out failed something that they cared very deeply about, and we call the teacher and we say, can you please, just let them have the passing grade, that's actually problematic for their development. We're interfering with things that are really important for them to experience throughout their developmental trajectory. And I think the same thing goes in other pockets of our life. But I think the message around guilt is to notice it, to ask what kind of information it's offering that's helpful, to ask yourself, from a value-oriented perspective, what kind of a parent or worker or whatever the role is do you want to be in that moment? If you have access to it, what does the science say about what a helpful versus unhelpful way to engage in this relationship might be? And then from there, to make a choice rather than sort of a reflexive, immediate, impulsive choice, to be more deliberate and thoughtful, and to not just assume that guilt is right, but to sort of be curious about it. Like, what's it telling me that's helpful? How is it helpful versus not helpful? And pause before you choose. And when you choose, make a more deliberate, value-aligned, and hopefully scientifically informed choice.
Thank you so much for that explanation, because when we can look at these situations through that very different lens, it it can make such a powerful difference when our hearts are breaking because something's happened with our children that's gone wrong. I mean, gosh, we feel it in our bones, and we're meant to, of course, but they are opportunities for learning and for growth, and they come up more often than we would like. But what you've just said is incredibly important, that we are interfering with their development if we swoop in, and it takes the pressure off, doesn't it? Because the instinct is so often to fix it, to solve this problem, to make it better, and yet the very best thing that we can do is help them feel how they feel, give them permission to feel, validate how they feel, show empathy for how they feel. And that's really what they want, isn't it, at the end of the day? And none of us want someone to fix it most of the time. Yes, sometimes they do actually totally want us to fix it.
I'm sure they want us to fix it, but it really is problematic. I mean, you talk a lot about anxiety in children and help people with, anxiety in the younger years. And it is not the parents' fault, but there is sometimes this inadvertent messaging that we give our kids about the dangers of feeling that level of discomfort. And as you're saying, if we could empathize, validate, make space for it, and say, it's okay. Like, you feel rotten, that sucks, but also it's okay. Like, that feeling isn't going to kill you. In fact, you might learn and grow from it. If nothing else, you'll learn what you really care about. More likely, you'll learn lots more.
It's so interesting, this idea that we make our work from our wounds, or our research is me searches, as one expert shared on the podcast, that when we've lived it and experienced it and we want to understand it, it's a really powerful way to move forward. And what you've researched and shared, and you share in such a beautiful way, you're a brilliant writer, and with all of these examples from your own home and from the people who you've interviewed, it really does make a meaningful difference for people like me and other listeners who are doing the juggle that is life and parenting and work. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, in your book, you talk about the head approach, the feet approach, and the heart approach. And I wonder if you could briefly talk to us about those different elements of the writing that you've done around this topic of work, parenting, enrichment.
Yeah. So, this is a common separation in psychology, and certainly in acceptance and commitment therapy, which I know you talk a lot about on your podcast. This is a very relevant framework. So the head is sort of the mindset, the relationship that we have to our thoughts, the relationship that we have to the stories that we craft that are interpretations of like what's going on around us and what's going on inside of us. And in acceptance and commitment therapy, we think a lot not just about what thoughts we're thinking or what stories we're telling, but about our relationship to those thoughts and whether or not those thoughts and stories are helping us live in line with the kind of person that we want to be and building our lives in the directions that we care to build them in, or not, right? Because sometimes we have a thought that's quite true, but quite unhelpful. Like, for example, you might think to yourself, I'm not as good of a mom as that other mom. And maybe that's true. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to make that assessment anyway, but regardless of how true it is, it's probably not very helpful, because if we sit and just immerse ourselves in thoughts that are, punitive and shaming towards ourselves, how likely is it that we're going to show up as a good mom the next time we interact with our kids? How likely is it that we're going to feel really mindful and connected in an interaction that we have? And so how we relate to thoughts and how helpful they are to us is really important. And the mindset piece is really sort of like the through line of the book in all of my work, because really, if you are seeing, in this case, the relationship between your parenting and your work role is only conflictual, then you're going to filter out any opportunities for them to enrich, even if the enrichment is happening. And so, for me, when I was doing the interviews for the book, one thing that was just a really fun outcome that I didn't expect is that invariably after I would interview a working parent, and I was sort of searching for these, how do your roles help each other out? Tell me a little bit about that. And so many of the working parents said to me, I never thought about it that way. And it was really hard to think about it at first, but then I could see it. And then later they would reach out to me and say, now I see it everywhere. Now I see all these ways that my roles help each other out. So that was a very cool thing. I was almost doing like a mini intervention, totally not aware of it at the time. But I think once you start thinking about the way that the roles can help each other out, you see it everywhere. And that doesn't erase the fact that they also conflict. Both are true. Okay, so that's sort of the from the head piece. The from the feet piece is acceptance and commitment therapy talks a lot about committed action. So, whatever we're thinking about, if we're not doing anything about it in the world, it doesn't change much of how we are living or how we're interacting or what it is that we're getting from our efforts. And so it is important to sort of translate these ideas into behavioral action. So for example, taking breaks. Like I have an entire chapter about rest, and I have an entire chapter about subtracting that is all about, figuring out what is essential in your life and what is trivial, because a lot of the time we don't even notice that we're engaging for huge chunks of our day in things that don't actually matter to us. I mean, social media is sort of the easy example. And this isn't to say that social media doesn't have any value. I think it actually does have value. And, for me as a writer, it's a way that I communicate my work to people who might be interested and might benefit from it. So it has value. But we can find ourselves getting sucked in to things that don't matter that much. Another area for parents is like, how much time are you spending on things that you wouldn't choose to, but you feel like everybody else is. And so you just kind of follow because you don't want to, have your kid left out, or you don't want to feel judged. But if you can sort of really connect to your values and figure out what's important and what's not, sometimes you're spending time on things that don't matter that much, and it doesn't leave time for the things that matter much more to you. And for me, downtime is one of those. And when I'm too busy, I don't have time for downtime with my family. And I love just hanging out with my kids. So subtracting some of the things like after school activities was really important for us. So I have chapters on relationships, how as a working parent, you can still nurture your primary romantic relationship, but also you can use those tools for friendships and other kinds of relationships as well. There's a chapter on creativity, and then there's a chapter on practical wisdom. So it's all of these more behavioral, concrete, like things that you can actually do out in the world that make your life more satisfying, more skillful, more successful. And then the last section from the heart is really about our emotional lives. So I have a chapter there about rethinking stress. We kind of talked about the mindset around stress, like threat versus challenge. So I dive deep into that. And then increasing happiness. So as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, I'm really a huge fan of positive psychology. And there's so many cool tools that really relate to how do we build happiness as people who have lots of demanding roles. And there's some very, very cool ways. And I'll just mention one, which is there's a very well-researched theory called self-determination theory. And it basically says that happy lives have regular experiences that fall into three categories. So it's experiences of agency, so like where you get to choose what you're doing. Experiences of mastery, so where you feel really competent at whatever it is that you're doing, and experiences of connection. So either connection to yourself, connection to a mission that is greater than you, or connection to people that you deeply care about. And so what I think is really fun in lives that are very full is that if you have a role that is not offering you one of these, you can really turn to whatever role might offer. So for example, if, your kid is like dictating your sleep schedule, then can you go to work and have a sense of agency in what task you do first? Or if you're really feeling isolated at work, can you go home and get some hugs from your kids and a sense of connection? So in this way, we can actually use our multiple demands to fulfill our happiness needs. And there's a lot more ideas that I write about in the book. But, in acceptance and commitment therapy, we're really interested in people's emotional lives, but we're also interested in helping them improve that through their action. And sort of going back to the very first, like that requires having a mindset that enables you to sort of pursue the right action in the right way.
Among the examples that you have collected along the way through all of your interviews with both women and men, working parents, I wonder if when you had feedback from your interviewees about how they were seeing things differently, did you also get feedback about any changes? Can you share one change that one person perhaps made that made a meaningful difference, just before we talk about how people can connect?
Sure. Yeah. So my favorite story of change that happened pretty quickly was a comedian that I interviewed. So it was a woman, she mostly did her comedy at night and would kind of act as like, primary default caretaker during the day. She looked for all intents and purposes like a stay-at-home mom. I almost didn't know that she was a comedian until I had gotten to know her pretty well. But what she told me as I was talking to her about these concepts is that, oh, I feel so guilty all the time. And in fact, my kids really lay it on thick. She had at the time a fifth grade son who every time she would leave for a comedy show would say, oh, you're leaving to go hang out in seedy bars instead of being a good parent. And it would eat away at her. And so we started talking about this idea of work-family enrichment. And, she really started thinking about it like, she told lots of jokes about her family. Actually, I think the majority of her show was jokes about her kids and her husband. So yeah, they provided her with fodder, but did it still make her a bad mom? And so pretty soon after I interviewed her, she had a comedy show and her son said something snarky. And so she was thinking about it and she actually asked him, do you really think that I'm a worse parent because I am a comedian? And he said, no, I think it's so cool. And she had never thought to ask him. He was just being a snarky son of a comedian. But it turned out that he was just teasing her and thought it was like the coolest thing ever to have a mom who was doing this kind of activity, that he was incredibly proud of her and like, thought it was just neat. And for her, it was like a weight lifted. So it really shifted like her ability to even get curious. Like, is that all there is to what he thinks? And to invite him to share more in a less snarky way, that just really shifted how she thought about herself as a working parent.
Oh, I got chills when you told me that because I think I was putting myself so deeply in her shoes and feeling just how, it's like a knife to the heart es- for a child to be saying that, especially as you're leaving and you've got to be witty and light and quick on your feet, fun and entertaining, and remember what it is that you've got planned. And gosh, what a weight off her shoulders. And I think that's a really beautiful place for us to tie things in a bow, because this idea that we can have these conversations, that we can open these doors with our children in age appropriate ways and get some insights from them and have family discussions about these things. From my point of view, my work is incredibly fulfilling, but there are times when it takes me away. I'm on a plane interstate, or I'm presenting to an international audience at 10 o'clock at night, or we're meeting this morning at 6 a.m. for me, the afternoon for you. It's never going to be smooth sailing when it comes to this blended life, but the way that you have talked to us about it today, the way you've shared your research, the insights, the findings from this moment forward, I too will be looking. It's that default mode network, isn't it? Default mode network, is that the correct?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
It's this idea that once we've had something revealed to us, we can't not see it. And I hope that parents listening, I know that they will be doing the same. And I invite you listening to share on Instagram with Yael and with myself, and to share what it is that you're noticing so other parents can see it too, perhaps those that haven't listened to us. Yes. Yes. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your work. It's really powerful. It's really impactful. And I'm so grateful that you were able to share so much of it with us today in a short period of time. There's so much more. So where can people find the book? What's your website? Please tell us more about the podcast and how people can connect.
Sure. Well, first, just thank you so much for having me on. It was such a delight talking with you. And I think your podcast is just so wonderful. So I'm honored to be a part of it,
Oh, thank
a part of the collection.
Thank you.
And my book is available in sort of all the traditional places that one can buy books, Amazon and all the rest. And you can find me, my website is workparentthrive.com. You can find links to my written pieces and to my podcast, or you can just look for my podcast, which is called Psychologists Off the Clock. If you like Jody's podcast, you might also like ours. We talk about similar themes, a broad range of themes in evidence-based psychology, with authors who shed light on a lot of things that, we take for granted, that actually, thinking about it differently using tools from psychology can be quite helpful. I also just recently started a newsletter that's really focused on relationships. So to some extent, the relationship between roles, but I'll be diving in more deeply to relationships between people, partners, parents and children, friendships, and sharing how we can use science on relationships to thrive more in our relational lives. So you can find that through my website too, or by following me on social media. There's all the links there too.
Oh, brilliant. And I will link out to all of those in the show notes. You knew I was going to say that, didn't you? Yeah, thank you again so much for your time. Honestly, I'm very, very grateful. And I know our working parent listeners will be moving forward in their lives with a very, very different view of work and family life and all of the different domains of life. And you've contributed so positively, and I'm very grateful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review. To keep the conversation going, I'd love you to join me over on Instagram. You'll find me at Dr. Jodie Richardson. Also, if you'd like a copy of my free 5-day mini email course, Calm Your Anxious Brain, then jump over to my website, drjodirichardson.com, and you can sign up down the bottom. I've really enjoyed having your company. Thanks so much. See you next time.